Okay, I guess I will just start going with some kind of more housekeeping sort of tasks as people are still joining us. So my name is Jenna Martyn-Fisher. I work for the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District. So we have recently been diving into some new community agriculture initiatives, and one of the ones we're working on is soil-led doing education and outreach, particularly in the Portland area. Laura will explain a little bit more about that project in a moment. I'm responsible for a lot of our education and outreach programming, though. So as you're joining, just if you're not presenting, please keep your microphone and video turned off. Hopefully that will make it so that all of our presenters are kind of the front pictures on the screen. Although right now I'm just looking at Bruce, so I'm not sure what's going on there. At the end, we will have a Q&A section. We'll be starting with the questions that were pre-submitted during your registration. And throughout the presentation, if you have questions that come up, please enter them into the chat. And when we get to the Q&A at the end, we will get to those questions as well. And as Damon just mentioned, this presentation will be recorded and that recording has started. So just be aware of that. And we will send that recording out after this.
All right, so let's get this show on the road. I want to say thank you to everybody who has tuned in and is tuning in today to participate in this webinar discussion, What's in Your Soil? Let's talk about lead in Maine's soils. I'm really excited for this opportunity to share with everyone the collective expertise that we have on this panel today. So my name is Laura Heinlein, and I will be the moderator of today's panel discussion. I am the AmeriCorps Environmental Steward with the Maine Conservation Corps, and I'm serving with the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District. So one of my main roles at the district is to coordinate the Portland Soil Lead Awareness Project, which Jenna mentioned. This project is a 2-year Environmental Protection Agency Healthy Communities grant-funded project. And so that is definitely a mouthful, but basically what we are doing is we are targeting outreach in 4 neighborhoods on Portland's peninsula to raise awareness about lead contamination in their soils and the high risk for lead contamination in their soils. These 4 neighborhoods were identified through past studies to quantify the extent to which lead is an issue in these 4 neighborhoods. And our program is focusing on educating people and communities about the high risk in their soils. So we have been collecting soil samples and plant tissue samples, and so far we have collected 80 samples from gardens in and around the Portland Peninsula in these target neighborhoods. And 67% of the samples that we've tested have shown above background levels of lead contamination. I think it's important to note that past studies that have taken soil samples from these target areas have shown up, like every single sample that was collected, 100% of the samples contained concentrations of lead to the extent to which that it was dangerous to garden, so you needed to implement various safety techniques. But the ultimate goal of our project is to get people connected with the fact that there might be lead in their soil. And the way that you do that, the way that you find out, is through a soil test. So if you are anywhere in Maine, you can show up to the Portland Soil Shop, which is happening this Saturday at the Portland Farmers Market. So Saturday, September 26th. If you bring a cup or 2 of soil in a Ziploc bag that you are curious to see what the concentration of lead is, we will test that soil for free. And you can bring as many samples as you'd like. So if you're curious about an area where you want to start a garden, or a garden that you already have up and going, or an area where children play, these are all good areas to test for lead contamination. And we will do that again for free. So come find us at the Portland Farmers Market this weekend. All right, so I think that's all from me. So let's meet the panel. So Panelists, I will call on you and then make sure to unmute yourself. And please say your name, your position, your affiliated organization, and what you do or have done related to soil health and or soil lead. All right, Bruce, let's start with you.
Me first. Okay. My name is Bruce Hoskins. I manage the University of Maine soil testing program for over 30 years now. And we've been screening samples for above normal background lead levels just in routine fertility testing for something over 25 years now. So this is a great program. I'm glad you undertook it.
Thank you, Bruce. All right, Sam, you are up next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha Langley. I am currently Vice Provost for Graduate Education, Research, and Outreach at Northern Kentucky University, which is in the greater Cincinnati area. But prior to that, I've been down here for 5 years. Prior to that, I was Professor of Environmental Science at University of Southern Maine, where the majority of my research focused on urban soil testing and urban soil heavy metal contamination and impacts to human health.
Thank you, Sam. Up next, Tom.
Yes, hi, I'm Tom Simmons. I'm a staff toxicologist here at the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the Environmental and Occupational Health Program. I've been a staff toxicologist here for about 7 years, working mostly on human health risk assessments for lead, in particular residential soil lead exposures, and looking at impacts in children, as well as lead in water in homes and the impact on blood lead levels.
Thank you, Tom. Riley, up next.
Hello, my name is Riley Sunday, and I work for the Allegheny County Conservation District in Pittsburgh, PA. I currently manage 2 of our water quality programs, but our district has a soil health and soil lead program that provides free soil lead testing at community events and also works with urban farmers and gardeners to test their spaces for lead contamination. Some of our work includes free soil lead testing for community members seeking to participate in the city's vacant lot adoption program, which requires soil lead tests. And we provide this testing free of charge and create lead heat maps for the farmers and gardeners to use.
Thank you, Riley. Last but not least, Dave. I don't think we can hear you. So. Dave, I think you have to unmute yourself. Now I think we can hear you. Try again.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
My name is Bill, state soil scientist with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, position I've held for over 33 years. And in that position, I work a lot with farmers. I'm also a licensed forester, a licensed soil scientist, a wetland scientist, and a licensed site evaluator. So I deal with soil in a lot of different manners. Soil health is one of my specialties. I do not have a lot of expertise in lead in soil, but I do in soil health.
We're delighted to have you here, Dave. And thank you, panelists, for agreeing to participate in this event. We're really excited to hear about what you have to say. Panelists, if you have anything to add, just a reminder, please use the hand-raising function. So if a question was not directed to you, but you have some information that you think would be useful, we'd love to hear it. Just use that hand-raising function. And audience, please feel free to use the chat box, which is at the top left of your screen. It's a little speech bubble. And you can type any questions you have throughout the webinar in that section, and we will address all of those questions at the end of the webinar. So, all right, so without further ado, let's get started. So Dave, this first question is for you. What is healthy soils, and what are the key characteristics of healthy soils, particularly in urban areas?
I don't seem to be able to have a picture on my screen because I did send you a picture which is going to be presented. I'm not sure why I don't have anything on my screen, but
Can you see it now, Dave? I just shared it.
now I see nothing. Blanks. There we go. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Hopefully everybody else should be able to see
Great.
that as well.
Soil health is a relative term that is becoming more popular these days. And generally speaking, when we talk about soil health, we're talking about soil that's used for agricultural purposes. Many people don't realize it, but soil isn't just a mixture of sand, silt, clay with some rocks perhaps in it. You do need to have organic matter in the soil and also millions of microorganisms that are very, very important. It's actually an ecosystem in order for it to be soil. One of the problems with urban soils is that the soil that you find on especially small, highly urbanized areas is material that was brought in, and it may or may not yet have developed into an actual soil. On your screen, you'll see 4 different soil profiles. I used a shovel and dug them out and laid them down side by side in different situations. The 3 on the left came from a farmer's field. The one to the far left, you can see is kind of chunky, a short ways below the top of the soil profile. The top, by the way, is at the top of the picture. That chunkiness is what we call a plow pan, and it's due to compaction, driving over it, and the plow squashing the ground underneath it. In a typical soil in the state of Maine, in fact, most anywhere, the upper soil horizon, 50% of that soil profile volume is pore space. That's where air and water move, and that's where microbes and roots travel. It's very, very important. If you compact the soil, then you don't have that pore space, and it limits what types of activities can occur in the soil, the microbes, air and water movement, and it's a problem. So the soil on the left is the soil on the right was taken on the side slope in that farm field, not all the way to the right, the one not in the box, but to the right or just to the left of the box. That soil is highly eroded, and what you'll see there is there's a few inches on top that's not compacted, and then from there on down, the soil is highly compacted, meaning that you have a very limited area for plant roots, air, and microbes to move in that particular soil. The one in the middle of those 3 showing you a soil that was at the edge of the garden that wasn't compacted and it wasn't eroded. And it has very good granular structure, lots of roots, and air and water can move through it freely. The one all the way to the right is what all of these soils looked like before they were turned into agriculture. It is the natural soil profile in a forest that was converted to agriculture after a while.
So Dave, as a follow-up question, which one of these would most accurately describe soil in an urban area, or none of these would?
Probably none of them actually would, because all of those are natural soil.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible in an urban area for it to be a natural soil and not man-made. And if that was the case, many times it'll look a lot like the one just to the left of that soil tray in a box. Very, very compacted, because when you put build on, they compact the soil very heavily, and it takes a long time for that soil to develop a good structure. So probably the one to the right and just to the left of that box.
Great. Thank you so much for that input. All right, so we're going to move on to the second question. This one is for you, Tom. What are the challenges surrounding soil and public health in urban, industrial, and residential areas? How are these similar, and how do they differ across the 3?
Yeah, certainly. So from a soil health kind of chemical contaminant exposure point of view, I think the challenge with any soil is really determining what contamination is present, and you don't know what's present until you test. So it's great that you guys are offering some free lead tests this weekend. So that's wonderful. Like I say, you don't know until you test. And really with all areas, whether urban, industrial, residential, or even rural, have the potential to be contaminated with some contaminant. Some of the more common contaminants of concern in soil include lead, as well as other metals, arsenic, cadmium, a class of chemicals called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are sometimes common in more urban industrial environments. And lead is actually a common soil contaminant in both urban as well as residential areas. And in general, as compared to residential areas, soil contamination is higher in areas that have large industrial impacts or just general urban areas. And studies have actually shown for most soil contamination, including lead, as you move away from industrial and urban centers, soil contamination levels tend to decrease. However, on a smaller scale, soil contamination can be highly variable in both urban as well as residential settings. So for example, in urban areas, there may be some hotspots, soil contamination in particular areas due to some historical industrial releases or manufacturing processes that have taken place over time in a small area. One other thing to consider in urban areas is particularly around high traffic areas. Soil next to roads can be contaminated from the historical use of lead and gasoline. So if you're in those areas, those can be, particularly problematic for higher concentrations of lead. In residential areas, similar to urban areas, it can be quite variable for lead contamination. Mostly this is due to lead from a lead-based paint in homes, particularly if the home's built before 1978. As is often the case in Maine, we have quite a few older homes or older housing stock. So most of the homes do have some lead-based paint hazards associated with them, both internally as well as externally. And for soil contamination, typically in a residential setting, lead concentrations will decrease as you move away from the home. So closer to the home, the foundation, near the drip line, soil concentrations of lead can be higher. And then as you move further away, those can be, decrease in concentration. So I think in any area, soil health from a chemical contaminant point of view, it's just important to be aware of your surroundings and what could be present, and you don't know until you test and find what's there.
Thank you, Tom. That was a really great answer. All right, so let's move on to the third question. Bruce, this is for you. Lead is the most common contaminant in urban soils in the United States, just like Tom mentioned. Give a brief overview of the options and commonly used techniques for soil testing in Maine and in other areas with contaminated soil.
Okay, well, as I said, we've been screening for lead in our routine fertility tests for over 25 years. It's a good way to screen a large number of samples for virtually no increase in overhead on our part. But I certainly would second everything that Tom has just mentioned. Most of our sources of lead contamination are primarily from lead paint. We do see some scrap metal contamination in disposal areas in urban environments. And occasionally we'll see at sites of old orchards, that's another source of contamination. Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question. Okay. So when you talk about routine utility tests, is this the standard soil test that you get at the University of Maine Analytical Lab when you submit a soil sample, or is it another sort of routine utility test?
Well, yes, we do extract lead along with the essential nutrients that we're looking for in the fertility test. It's not a highly precise test, but it's good enough to determine which samples are contaminated at some level or which are at normal background levels. lead's just a naturally occurring trace element in all soils. It's detectable in all soils, but we're just looking for elevated levels. And once we flag a level as above normal background, then we do a secondary test at no charge to the consumer, which is much more precise and really zeroes in on the total lead content of the soil. And we'll send out a secondary report with the total lead content and some suggested guidelines for minimizing intake.
So is there a reason why you only test for lead when you do these screenings, or is there easy access for other contaminants to screen for other heavy metals or other organic contaminants in soils?
We don't have the capability to test for organic contaminants. We do screen actually for other metals, cadmium, chromium, nickel, and lead, of course. Those are fairly easy for us to analyze. We do actually do additional metals testing, but it gets much more complicated and much more expensive for metals like arsenic. Mercury especially is fairly challenging to analyze. We do run that as well here at the lab on request. But that's within our normal capabilities of doing elemental analysis, including these all those metals that we can either easily screen for, or for more in-depth testing, we can do things like arsenic, selenium, mercury, those types of metals. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. All right, this next one is for you, Riley. What are the key indicators associated with soil contamination? We're especially interested in hearing ones that are easily identified in the present, such as old building foundations, but also in areas that are high risk due to historical land use, as someone mentioned, perhaps old orchards.
Sure. So I'd like to echo a lot of what Tom and Bruce were talking about. So in Pittsburgh, we have two main causes of soil lead contamination. Number one would be lead paint. And although lead paint was recognized as a dangerous substance much earlier, it was used to paint homes in Pittsburgh until the 1980s. And the second greatest cause, but to a significantly lesser degree, is leaded gasoline, which was not banned in Pittsburgh until 1999. So these two source factors combined with narrow streets and tightly packed homes in the city have resulted in this widespread contamination. So under this context, when we're looking at residential lots where the structure is still standing and we're trying to assess contamination risk, there's a typical pattern of lead deposition. A typical pattern shows heightened levels along the street where lead would have been deposited by gasoline, and then a lower concentration towards the middle of the front yard, and then higher levels near the home, particularly, like Tom mentioned, in the path of drip lines. And this is primarily from leaded paint. And then we also see a little bit of a drop off in contamination levels in the backyard. Sometimes there's higher concentrations in the backyard near painted fence lines or sheds as well. Although this typical pattern of deposition is helpful when the home or building is on the property, these predictors are not always reliable on vacant lots where the structure is no longer in place. A history of poor demolition practices in Pittsburgh has significantly changed the typical patterning of lead. Often lead paint chips and other contaminated debris are spread across the lot, leading to hotspot areas. And this is one of the motivations of our district to perform soil lead testing for community members working on these lots. Because lead is such an immobile element, where the lead is deposited is typically where the lead will stay. And so we can have these spaces where you have extremely high contamination directly beside an area with little to no contamination. And that's why it's important to take many tests and to keep track of where these spots are occurring, particularly in areas where a typical deposition pattern is difficult to discern. There are other land use practices that also contribute to lead contamination. Orchards, as Bruce mentioned, or places that were once orchards, have been known to test higher for soil lead contamination. due to the use of pesticides like lead arsenate. Again, lead is not a mobile element, so once it's in the soil, it's likely to stay there for a long time, which is why knowing the history of the land use or former structures can be really important in predicting high-risk areas in your yard, garden, lots, or other areas.
Thank you, Riley. Sam, I have a follow-up question for you. So Riley mentioned that gas and paint were really impactful in Pittsburgh in particular. I'm wondering if in your studies in collecting soil samples in Portland over the past, when you were working at USM, if you found similar trends in distribution or if you identified similar causes in contamination pathways.
We did, very similar to what Riley discussed. We found that most of the lead contamination was the result of lead-based paint. And similar to what she talked about in Pittsburgh, there has been such a rich history in downtown Portland of houses being demoed and built and demoed and built. It's really incredibly spatially variable. So very important to take lots of soil samples. In Portland, the other piece is that, as in Pittsburgh, there's a very rich industrial history going back hundreds of years, shipyards, and there was a lead paint factory in downtown Portland and railroad yards and lots of different industries that also contributed to the lead history that we have. Very hard in a city like Portland to tease out one from the other. The roads are very compact. There isn't not like some cities where you can actually see lead contamination decreasing as you get away from the roads. There are so many roads, you can't do that kind of analysis. Combined with the fact that there were houses everywhere. There was a fire in Portland back in the 1800s that burned a large part of the peninsula, and they took that rubble from the fire and they kind of plowed it all over the peninsula and filled in the low-lying areas. So that also compounds trying to do any kind of spatial analysis of where the lead is coming from.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that follow-up. All right, Tom, this next question. Oh, I think Bruce has something to add. So go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, just one other item, all these different sources that we're mentioning. There was a situation once where there was a building that had burned, and it was in very sandy soil, and it was the ash in the soil was very prominent. You could see it very easily, and the lead level in the various samples that we got from this site was directly correlated with the amount of ash that we found. So the lead, if a building burns, the lead will some of it goes off in the smoke, but it will concentrate in the ash. So it's not just foundations. If the building was removed, it is one thing, but if it burned, all that lead is still going to be there. Yeah.
Interesting. I think that's really relevant in regards to the fire that burned, I think, almost a third of the city in the 1860s in Portland. So, all right, Tom, this next question is for you. The Environmental Protection Agency defines exposure pathways as the way a person can come into contact with hazardous substances. There are three basic exposure pathways: inhalation, ingestion, and direct contact. What are the key exposure pathways for people living on and gardening in contaminated soil?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the primary exposure pathway of concern for people living and gardening in lead-contaminated soil in particular is really soil ingestion. For lead, we're not all that concerned about inhalation exposures from soil, nor direct contact dermal exposures. Our skin actually does a pretty good job of keeping lead out in the forms that it's found in soil. And really with soil ingestion, you can think of this as kind of three general pathways. I like to think of it as soil to human, soil to plant to human, and then soil to home to human. So for soil to human, think of incidental soil ingestion from direct contact uses. This is more often what we're thinking about for young children due to increased hand-to-mouth activity in a residential yard or in a gardening setting. They can have or may inadvertently eat some of that soil, and that can be a direct pathway there. For a soil to plant to human pathway, I think of this as more of two parts. One is actually plant uptake from the soil into the plant, and the other is soil adhering to the outside of the plant. Fortunately for lead, most plants don't take up much lead, so it's poorly taken up into most plants. So the primary concern here in this pathway from gardening exposures really is soil adhering to the outside portion of the plant. So if you think of lettuce or root crops or tubers, carrots, potatoes, those kinds of crops can have higher soil contamination on the exterior portions. And if not properly washed, this can result in some direct ingestion there. And then the last kind of ingestion pathway is a soil to home to human. And this is really more about tracking in soil from either a residential yard or a garden. And then that soil contributes to overall dust levels in the home. And again, the concern here is mostly for young children due to increased hand-to-mouth activity can lead to some exposures there. So in general, for the three exposure routes, we typically look at ingestion, inhalation, and dermal. For soil lead contamination, it's primarily soil ingestion that we're concerned about.
Okay, so I guess my next question for you, Tom, is why is lead harmful to human health?
Yeah, certainly. So lead serves no useful purpose in the body. Some elements like copper or zinc, manganese, are required for the body to function normally. This isn't the case for lead, and research over the past few decades has shown that lead can affect nearly all systems in the body. And most of what we know about lead comes from studies actually in humans, where researchers use the amount of lead measured in blood to determine the level of exposure. And for the most part, when we talk about lead exposure and health effects, we're focused on health effects that occur at low-level lead exposures, typically defined as a blood lead level less than 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is just a measure of the concentration of lead in blood. And for health effects in children, the developing nervous system is the most sensitive system impacted by lead exposures, particularly at low-level lead exposures. And exposure during early childhood can affect neurological development, so it can impair learning and memory, decrease executive functioning skills. It can affect the development of hearing and fine motor skills. All of this combined in the neurological system has been shown to decrease IQ scores and academic performance later in life, as well as exposure during childhood is associated with attention-related behavior disorders or problems, as well as abnormal social behavior such as aggression. An important point to consider with children is researchers consider there to be no safe level of lead exposure below which there is no risk for any poor developmental or intellectual function. So essentially no safe level of lead exposure for a developmental system. When we're thinking about adults, two of the more sensitive systems impacted by lead are the cardiovascular system and the renal system or kidneys. So at lower level lead exposures have been associated with increases in blood pressure, and increased risk of hypertension, as well as some kidney damage and reduced kidney function at levels less than 5 micrograms per deciliter in adults. Some of the other health effects that typically occur at much higher blood lead levels, greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter, are disruption of red blood cells, anemia, some reproductive effects, health effects, as well as increased risk of low birth weight and lower bone mineral density, typically again higher blood lead levels or higher exposures. But for the most part, when we think about lead exposure, we're primarily concerned about low levels and impacts on children's neurological development.
So to follow up with that, how would you characterize the risk associated with lead in soil in comparison to lead in paints and lead in paints in homes and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So at least in Maine and other parts of the country, for the most part, if there's lead-based paint, lead-based paint hazards inside the home are typically the greater risk for young children in exposure, particularly for them to have an elevated blood lead level. So lead-based paints contribute to dust levels in the home, as well as there can be some direct interaction with chipping or deteriorating paint in the home. And that's typically the primary exposure that we're worried about in homes. There have been studies looking at soil exposure or higher levels of soil in residential yards and contributing to blood lead levels. So we do know that that is a contributing factor. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly if you have high soil levels and a lead-based hazard, what's going on, or lead-based paint hazard, I should say, what's the primary cause there. For the most part, in Maine in particular, we're not really all that concerned about water. We don't use a lot of lead plumbing in Maine, or haven't historically. There are some, but not much. So really it's lead-based paint hazards, I would say, is the greatest risk for childhood lead poisoning.
Thank you, Tom. All right, this next question is for you, Bruce. If you send a soil sample to the University of Maine Soil Testing Laboratory and it is tested for lead, you receive a document with 4 different categories of concentrations of lead, contaminated soils: normal, slight, moderate, and heavy. Can you explain how these designations were determined and what they mean?
Okay, so that's in the follow-up test where we've actually determined zeroed in on the actual total amount of lead in the soil. We start screening or we start flagging samples that roughly in the range of 75 to 100 parts per million. So if you're not familiar with the parts per million scale, 10,000 parts per million is 1%. So we're talking about fractions of a percent here. But yeah, these are generally anything less than about 50 parts per million is what we would normally consider to be normal background level. There's a lot of variability there, but depending on the original mineral material that the soil is derived from, but generally less than 50 parts per million we consider to be pretty much normal background. It's not a concern, no health concern. Somewhere around 75 or 100 parts per million, we start to flag it as being somewhat contaminated. As I said, we've been doing this for about 25 years. So 25 years ago, I based the first category of slight contamination or low contamination at somewhere between 50 and 300 parts per million. And I chose 300 at that time because that was in one of the early Boston lead studies that was looking at elevated blood lead levels in children's play in children, and correlating that with soil in their play areas. So that was like the first level of concern was around 300 parts per million. And then the next level, more or less for gardening, was around 500 parts per million, which was generally considered to be a problem level, or the start of a problem level for vegetable production at that time. Of course, these are all based on what was considered to be the acceptable blood lead level in children at the time, or in people at the time, and those have declined over the last 20 to 30 years. And as more medical research has occurred. So those levels are somewhat dated, but our primary concern is to let people know whether the lead level in their soil is a normal background level or if there's some level of contamination. But anything above 500 parts per million were considered to be fairly heavily or high or very high levels of contamination, and we see levels well up over 1,000, 2,000. I think we've seen 6,000 parts per million in some cases, right next to buildings with a lot of lead paint chips. But that's how those were originally established. And most likely those will be migrating downward somewhat with new information.
Interesting. Can you speak a little bit more about the categories migrating downwards with new information?
Well, EPA has, and Tom and I have spoken about or conversed about this somewhat already. EPA has established a problem level at about 400 parts per million. And probably Tom can address that a little more technically, succinctly than I can. But that's kind of in the middle of our moderate contamination level, or at least our dated moderate contamination levels. So yeah, that's the 400 parts per million is kind of the level that EPA is working with now for what is it, casual contact, I believe. Mm-hmm. But if certainly children's play areas, and we've always emphasized this, that if there's any level of contamination above normal background, you really need to have a safe play area, build a wooden sandbox. Don't let them play in the native soil. Bring in some nice clean sand for them to play in. That's certainly the most sensitive situation that we're testing for. Yeah.
Thank you both. All right. Tom, would you like to add something?
I'll just quickly chime in to talk about just briefly the 400 standard there, the EPA sets, and how it could potentially, as a conversation with Bruce, bring levels lower. And then that 400 is really set on a blood lead level of 10 micrograms per deciliter. More recently, the federal CDC has dropped their recommended blood lead level, reference level, to 5 micrograms per deciliter, or even lower. And so at this point, that 400 could be lowered just from a general point of view, and that may, from a blood lead level exposure, decrease what would be acceptable in soils for gardening or residential areas.
Thank you. That's interesting that the standards change as we progress in our understanding. All right, so the next question is for you, Sam. Is it possible to garden safely on lead-contaminated soil? What steps can gardeners take to garden safely, and how do these steps vary depending on the concentration of lead and the location of the garden?
Sure. So, as others have mentioned, it's always best to eliminate that pathway of exposure between the soil and yourself, regardless of the degree of lead contamination, especially with young children. I think you always need to err on the safe side. And so it's certainly possible to garden as long as you can eliminate that pathway of exposure. So we almost always recommend, well, certainly probably the best thing to do, although the hardest and the most expensive, would be to remove all your lead contaminated soil and replace it with clean soil. For most people, that is not an option. So the next best option is raised bed, similar to the sandbox that Bruce just mentioned. You have to be careful with raised beds. Certainly have a landscape fabric that you place between that raised bed and the natural soil. One thing that you have to be careful with over time is that landscape fabric may degrade, or an especially enthusiastic gardener may penetrate that landscape fabric with their shovel or their tool. So you just need to be careful as you put that landscape fabric down and build your raised bed that you do maintain that layer, or that layer that prevents exposure between yourself and the natural soil. Problems that some people have had is that they buy what they think is clean soil and bring it into their raised bed and then have it tested and find out it's not clean. That's not necessarily because the person that they bought the soil from is trying to be deceptive. Oftentimes what happens is greenhouses get the topsoil that they sell from places where people have bought a piece of a farmer's field, let's say, and stripped all the topsoil to build houses and have sold it to the greenhouse resells it. And then what we find later is, as others have mentioned, that perhaps that farm was an orchard and that topsoil might have contaminated. And so people end up with contaminated soil in their raised bed as well. So that is also something to be careful of. But I think the message is that it is certainly, you can certainly garden on lead contaminated soil, but not in the lead contaminated soil.
And that is a key difference. So speaking of key differences, what are the differences between your recommendations for gardening on, say, 200 parts per million and 1,200 parts per million?
Again, what I've always told people is that I would err on the side of caution. And especially if I had a young child, I would not behave any differently in terms of my precautions with 200 parts per million versus 1,200 parts per million. And I often look to the European studies when I think about these things, because in many of these areas, the Europeans have been dealing with it a lot longer than we have, and they have a tendency to be more progressive in terms of some of their environmental policies. And if you look at a lot of the European countries, what they consider an acceptable level of lead contamination is much lower than what we in the United States consider acceptable. So I look to that when I say that, well, I think you're better off erring on the side of caution if you have lead contamination in your soil above the baseline level that Bruce mentioned.
Well, thank you. The last question is also for you, Sam. Many recommendations for gardeners and homeowners with lead-contaminated soils focus on limiting exposure to the leaded soil rather than removing lead from contaminated soil and effectively cleaning the soil. What remediation techniques remove lead from the soil, and over what time frame?
So one of the things that we did in Portland, one of the research studies, was using plants to try to remove the lead from the soil. It's a process called phytoremediation. And we used several different types of plants to try this. We used spinach, we used brassica, which is a cabbage family, and we used sunflowers. All of them removed the lead to some degree over time, although spinach was certainly the most successful. It's important to note that if you're doing that, you're removing the lead from the soil, but you're just accumulating it in the plant. So you're not removing the lead from the system, you're just transferring it from the soil into a plant, and then you have to do something to safely dispose of that plant. This process works best on soils that are very acidic, which the soils in Maine are, because as the soil becomes more acidic, the lead becomes more mobile. So it's easier for the plants to take it up. As someone mentioned, I think maybe it was Bruce, or no, I think it was actually Riley. The lead doesn't go very far. It's not very mobile. And so that does make it hard for plants to take it up. But as the acidity of the soil decreases to the main levels of acidity, it becomes a little bit easier. So we were successful in reducing lead contamination, not down to a level that it would be considered safe. That would be something that would take many, many years. And so if you have a piece of land that you're willing to experiment on, you could certainly plant successive crops of leafy greens, work the best, to try to, over a long time period, many, many years, decrease the lead in the soil. But it is, again, important to remember that then you do have to dispose of those plants as the waste product that they are.
So a follow-up question there, how would you recommend that people dispose of those plants that have then accumulated the lead in their tissues?
Well, according to the Maine regulations, unless they've changed in the 5 years that I've been gone, if you're doing this in your backyard, those plants are considered household hazardous waste. So you would dispose of them however you would dispose of your regular household hazardous waste. Which technically means that you could put it in your garbage bag and put it out on the curb for the city truck to come and pick it up. As an environmental scientist, that is not something that I would necessarily support, but legally, that is the way that you could dispose of it. Other than that, certainly when we were at the university, we had waste streams for hazardous waste, and that's what we used to dispose of plants. I'm sure Bruce at the soil testing lab, he has his waste stream that he uses to dispose of those. A little bit harder for a homeowner in Maine, although there is, I think, still the hazardous waste landfill where you can send stuff at a cost.
Fair enough. So Riley, I have a follow-up question for you as well. Have you come across any remediation techniques to effectively remove the lead from contaminated soil in your work in Pittsburgh?
Because of the challenges that we've talked about with handling lead in the soil, we don't focus as much on removing the lead, because the only successful way we found to remove lead contamination from our soils is to remove the soil. And that's a really expensive and logistically complicated option. So we focus a lot on using dilution to take care of higher levels of lead contamination and moderate levels of lead contamination, bringing in clean fill and compost and building soil health to increase both the soil health and its functionality as a living microbiome, but also the phosphate in compost helps to bind with lead particles and keep it in the soil. We've also experimented with using cover crops on some larger areas and incorporating those into the soil for dilution and green manure to help build soil organic matter.
Great, and thank you, Riley. Bruce, do you have anything to add about potential remediation recommendations?
Well, we've always recommended minimizing lead mobility in the soil or its potential for uptake by keeping the pH fairly high, somewhere between 6 and 7. As Sam already mentioned, the lower the pH, the more mobile the lead and other metals are in the soil. So if you raise the pH, not only do your plants grow better, but most plants can't tolerate a very low pH, most vegetable plants. But keeping the pH up fairly close to 7, which is a neutral pH, will help to tie up the lead in unavailable forms. Also by adding, as Riley said, adding lots of organic matter to the soil, that helps to, it's called a chelation effect, where it binds with lead and other metals and basically immobilizes them. So high pH, high organic matter are the best ways to immobilize lead in the soil. Yeah.
Thank you for that addition. All right, so I am going to ask all the panelists one final concluding question, and it is, what is the key message you want gardeners and homeowners with lead in their soil to take away from this discussion? So I'm just going to call on you again. So Dave, we will start with you.
I guess what I do, again, I'm not a lead expert, but keeping your soil healthy is a good way to tie up the lead in the soil. The two primary soil health impacts of urban soils are compaction and low organic matter content. So if you have a very compacted soil, you're probably not going to grow much in it anyway. And if you don't have a lot of organic matter, you're not going to grow much of it in it anyway. So if you keep the pH up, have high levels of organic matter, and improve the soil structure so you have less compaction, it's a healthier soil, and it sounds like it would be able to grow more and have less availability of lead.
Thank you, Dave. What about Bruce? What are your key take-home messages from this discussion?
Well, I would echo what Dave just said. Keep your soil healthy. You can grow cover crops. Keep something growing on that site all the time. Even if when you're done with your vegetable crop, throw in some oats or something like that, a nice quick sprouting crop that feeds the soil microbes, adds organic matter to the soil, and keep something growing there. Yeah, keep your soil healthy, keep the pH and the organic matter level fairly high, and know what you're dealing with. Test your soil once in a while, at least for fertility, and we will automatically screen for lead and other metals. And if it's a problem level, first of all, that's the best way to do something. You can't do anything about it until you know what's there. So test your soil, find out what you're dealing with, and take the proper remediation steps to minimize your exposure or the exposure of your family.
Thank you, Bruce. What about you, Tom? What do you think?
Yeah, working off Bruce's message there, it really, to me, the take home is, test your soil. You don't know what's there until you test, and you don't know what steps to take really until you do some of that testing. So I think that's an important aspect of it, is to know what you're working with, as Bruce said there.
Thank you. Sam, what do you think is the take home message?
I would say, not to be repetitive, I would say that soil lead contamination doesn't discriminate by race, gender, or income level. And so whether you're living in the, kind of a low-end neighborhood or a high-end neighborhood, your risk is just the same, especially in cities like Portland or Pittsburgh with a rich history of industrial activity and lead paint. So test. Don't make assumptions about what you think is in the soil based on what part of town you're living in.
And Riley, what about you? What do you think is the take-home message?
I really think the other panelists summed it up with testing and maintaining healthy soil. And the only thing I would add would be to just use good gardening practices. Wash your hands once you've been in the garden. If you know that there is soil contamination, be really mindful of your crop selection. If you're planting vegetables, choosing fruiting crops that are growing off the ground with smooth surfaces that are easy to clean off and keep the dust contamination off of those. Making sure the ground's always covered, composting, incorporating organic matter, and testing and maintaining soil fertility, all components of maintaining a healthy soil and a good garden and protecting yourself from soil lead.
Thank you, Riley, and thank you to our panelists for such thoughtful answers. We are going to move into the question and answer section. So we have, I think, received a fair number of questions in the chat box, as well as questions that were submitted before the webinar at the time of registration. So Jenna, do you want to start off by going through the questions in the chat box?
Sure. So starting from the top, Lucas had one for Bruce when he was talking about the ways that you test for soil. And so his question was, is that because of the instrumentation you have can only look at metals? So I think he was referring to why you only test for lead and not some of the other materials.
Well, we do screen for several metals, including lead, but yeah, our instrumentation is only that's why we don't have the capability of looking for organic contaminants. What's really interesting as far as instrumentation is what you're going to be doing this Saturday for your on-site testing. That's a different technology, which is actually really slick. It's just spot testing. It's called X-ray fluorescence, I believe, is what they're using. And this is something that we used to work with EPA in North Chelmsford. We'd screen for initial lead levels, send them down there for X-ray fluorescence analysis for free, and then they'd send us back the data that we would send back out to our customers. We're no longer able to do that, but it's really great for on-site testing, spot testing. It's very quick. But what you have to keep in mind is, as has been mentioned before, there's a lot of spot-to-spot variability. So don't just go to one spot, but take a composite, take a representative sample or a good overall average.
And I will take that moment to also put a plug in for our Saturday soil testing in Portland, which will be a partnership with the EPA lab. They'll be taking their samples back down to Mass and I believe using the XRF to take those samples. So our next question came from Glenn, and it is, what can you do about lead in old orchard soil?
Well, it's like any other lead contamination. It's not going anywhere. It's bound up with soil organic matter and on soil particle surfaces. You would treat it like lead contamination anywhere else. If it's bad enough, you would want to put down some landscape fabric and build a raised bed. Orchard contamination tends to follow where the old rows were in the orchard. They'll be more contaminated in the row than between the rows. So if you have a fairly large property, you can test around here and there and find out the extent of the contamination. And if you can find a clean area outside where the trees used to be, that's where you would want to garden.
I guess I would just add to that that you don't have to do anything with it if the soil is covered and there's no pathway of exposure. So
Right.
if you're willing to just let it ride as a field or a field with some old apple trees in it, that it's just fine. That there's no harm.
Okay, so our next question came from Heather, and I think she might have asked it before we kind of got into the last portion of questions about remediation. But if there's anything people want to add to it, her question is, what do you do if you have high lead in your soil? Is there a way to get rid of it, or do you just avoid it and take caution?
I think we pretty much
Yeah, we
addressed.
pretty much covered it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, for minimal levels of contamination, as this was mentioned before, fruiting vegetables tend to have the lowest potential internal content, and they also have some separation from the soil, so you don't get as much rain splash. One of the other things that I didn't mention before was once you have plants that are up and growing, you can use a surface mulch, straw or something like that, to minimize the rain splash up onto the outside of the edible portions of the plants, so like for leafy greens. But that's another way to minimize the contamination of what you're eating. Yes.
Question there. How much, like how thick should the layer of mulch be to make sure that you minimize that rain splash?
Oh, just an inch or two. You want to have
Okay.
the ground enough to completely cover the ground, so that when the rain impacts the soil, it doesn't splash, ricochet back up onto the plants.
Okay.
And I think we had just one more question, which was a follow-up to the what can you do about old orchard soil, which is, would lead be in orchard soil, or is it more likely to be arsenic?
It would be both. It's lead arsenate that was used before World War II. So we have many orchards in Maine that are 100, 200 years old. And, you know, before World War II, that was one of the primary pesticides that was used. And a lot of that's still there on those old sites.
Okay. In that case, Jenna, we can move into the pre-submitted questions.
I have one more.
Nope, go for it.
Came in right towards the end. So hypothetically, how would you advise a homeowner who discovers that they have hazardous waste levels of lead?
I suppose that falls into the remediation recommendations of adding compost and covering it with mulch and making sure your pH is high. I'm glad that we have a good, concise list of recommendations. That's a good thing to take away from this webinar.
All I'm going to add is it really depends on what you want to do with that piece of land. And if it's got a nice cover of grass, a nice thick cover of grass in the backyard, and there aren't going to be children with swing sets and things that could erode that grass down to the bare soil level, then it's not an issue, and you can just enjoy that piece of land.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. That's, I think, a good way to calm and quell some concerns from homeowners. All right, so the first pre-submitted question is, if I remediate my soil, such as by adding, all the things that we've mentioned in this webinar, but there is still lead paint on the building, how quickly could the soil be recontaminated?
Depending on the condition of the home, it could be almost immediately recontaminated. If the lead paint is flaking off the side of the house, as soon as the lead paint chips are in the soil is contaminated. So there are definitely some companies in our area, and I would imagine in Maine as well, that will do lead paint removal on homes, and the EPA has very specific standards for how that can be done safely to minimize potential further contamination.
Okay. Thank you, Riley. Okay, so the second question. My garden is in a high traffic area. How can I protect my soil and vegetables from lead contamination? And I believe this question is from somebody in an urban area. Bruce, do you want to tackle this one?
This is roadside contamination?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, there's some legacy contamination probably from the days of leaded gas, and it would be treated just like any other, contaminated area. Just eliminate the intake pathways. Usually alongside the road, you have a grass strip, but if that's where your vegetable garden is, you would treat it like any other contaminated area. There's no longer leaded gas in Maine, but there is also some concern with certain metals from tire wear, like cadmium, for instance, which is also another problem metal. But people have, planted a hedge, a short hedge, to minimize, traffic inputs, tire wear and that sort of thing, filtering into the lot. But yeah, if you're right on a busy road, that's a tough place to have a garden. I don't know if anybody else has any other suggestions.
Okay. So the third question is, my understanding is that fruit and nut trees, as well as berry bushes, can be safely grown and consumed in soils with higher levels of contamination. What is the scientific information to back this up, and does it apply to all cane and woody plants? Sam, do you think you could tackle this one?
Sure, and Tom probably could help me out as well. So we discussed how lead is not very mobile unless you have soils that are very, very acidic. And what that means in the example that I gave with the spinach plants is that most of the lead that the plants did take up was accumulated in the roots. Not only is the lead not mobile in the soil, but it is also not mobile in the plant. So it's a very small amount of that lead could make it from the roots to the shoots, and probably even a smaller amount would make it from the shoots to the fruit, if any. And so that is where the research comes from that says that it's probably likely that in the fruiting bodies of your plants, the lead levels would be at a level that is not dangerous. That being said, there are studies out there where people have done very, very in-depth research on many different types of plants, in roots and shoots, and many different ways of trying to prepare those plants, from just washing with soap and water to doing things that are more aggressive. And there have been situations where elevated lead levels are found in the fruiting bodies. So I don't think it is fair to make any kind of a general assessment of when it's going to be safe and when it's not going to be safe. Again, especially if you have young children that are going to be ingesting these nuts or fruits. So I think the safe bet always in these situations is if you know you have soils with a high degree of lead contamination and you want to be growing these things, is to have some of them tested and to see what the lead levels are. Knowing, of course, that all the things we've talked about, higher pHs, higher organic matter levels that go along with a healthy garden, will also reduce the mobility of that lead from the soil into the plant.
Thank you, Sam. Do you have anything to add to that, Tom? Or?
No, not much. The only thing I'll add is, some of the uptake, as Sam alluded to, can be concentration dependent. So if you're working with, soil levels that are quite high, there can be some movement from roots to shoots to leafy vegetable parts to even fruits in some instances. So again, it's important to know what concentrations you're working with. If it's relatively lower, close to background, 100, 200, and you're, doing good gardening practices with soil amendments, there's likely going to be less uptake into the edible portions of the plant, but at much higher levels, there certainly can be some uptake. So again, it's good to know what you're working with there.
Thank you. All right, so we have another follow-up question to the homeowner question. Does the panel, do any of you have thoughts on the legal liability and ethical consideration around disclosure and responsibilities for remediation? Riley, is this something you've talked about in Pittsburgh?
It is. Given the, we've tested, well, I should say there are over 15,000 vacant lots within the city of Pittsburgh limits, and we have tested about 250 of them and counting. And we get this question a lot, and we get a lot of homeowners that are nervous about having us test their soil because they're concerned that uncovering contamination will immediately lead them to be liable for the cleanup or for reducing the levels to EPA safe or background levels. But unfortunately, given the widespread contamination, as Dr. Langley said, there are so many areas that are contaminated, and it's not discriminating against socioeconomic status, race, gender, anything. So we generally encourage people that, you know, it's better to know what is in the soil than to not know, because the likelihood that it's everywhere is really high.
Okay. A follow-up question. If a homeowner discloses they have hazardous levels of lead, could they be required to remediate by a potential buyer? I don't know if any of you have the answer to that.
I believe the answer to that is yes. I certainly know if a landlord has their soil tested and they know the lead levels are high, they need to disclose to anybody who would be a potential renter in that space.
Mhm.
The rule is that if you've had it tested and you know the lead levels are high, you are obligated to disclose. It's when you don't know that everything, you know, as Riley said, a lot of people don't, if you don't know, then you're not obligated to do anything about it, which is part of the loophole and the problem.
Mm-hmm. And then the question is, if you are a resident or a renter, then do you have to disclose it to your landlord? And I think that's discouraged some people in Portland from getting their soil tested because they don't want to ask their landlord and they don't want to tell their landlord if they have lead contaminated soils. So
I think there's a concern too about what level is high contamination. So we know that there are no safe levels of lead in soil, but the EPA safe threshold for lead levels for adults is over 1,000 parts per million. And in Pittsburgh, we regularly see over 1,000 parts per million when we're soil testing, at least one hotspot per lot, up to we found areas with 8,000 parts per million. So at what point does it become unsafe, and at what point does it become a brownfield or an actionable location?
Yeah, I do get questions about, you know, do I have to disclose this? I'm just not a lawyer, so I don't know the legal answer to that. But as just to echo what Dr. Langley said, it's so ubiquitous. We basically tell anybody who's worried about lead contamination that if you have an older house, it's going to be pretty much automatic. You're going to have it on the lot at some level, at just about everywhere around the older buildings. So it's such a ubiquitous problem that as far as disclosure, I mean, the only option is to buy an open field and build a new house if you want to be completely, but there's a lot of great old houses out there. So, you know what you deal with, you know how to minimize the pathways for uptake, and enjoy your property. And just realize that everyone else is pretty much in the same boat. Anywhere on the East Coast.
And I'll just put a quick plug in here for, lead-based paint and hazards in the home. If you're in an older home, particularly built before 1978 or even before 1950s, it's good to, test for lead in the home, as well, especially if you have children. It's important to do that, and landlords are required to do some of that, as well as report any of those hazards that they find. And then we follow up on those hazards to help remediate those inside the home. And sometimes those can be soil hazards if soil at a residential setting is tested and above standards. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection will do some remediation for those soil levels to bring them down. So it does happen.
Thank you, Tom. All right, so we have 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So can lead contamination move from a contaminated area into a non-contaminated area or a remediated area through water drainage on a slope or other means? I think we've covered this a little bit, but.
Really, the soil itself has to move. So if the soil is eroded down the slope, then there's physical movement on the soil particles themselves. But if there's no soil movement, it's going to stay right where it is.
Okay. And then the last question, can dust from contaminated soil, traffic, and other airborne particulate matter be removed by washing the produce? How thoroughly do you have to wash the produce, and does it depend on the range of the concentration in which the produce is grown?
So I would just quickly chime in and say, yes, washing produce and those things can help remove, exterior soil contamination. Others here might have some better instructions or advice for washing those. But certainly if you're washing or removing outer layers of lettuce crops, so you're just getting the internal portions there that may not be as contaminated with external contamination, as well as peeling any carrots, potatoes, those practices will significantly reduce overall exposure there to soil adhering to the plant.
And I think Riley's also mentioned the ridges on the plant or on the produce that you're harvesting really matters. If there are a lot of ridges where soil and particles can get stuck, then it's more difficult to clean that produce. I just want to. That is all the questions that we are going to go over. So thank you, panelists, so much for agreeing to take part in this, and thank you, our audience, for your great questions and for listening to and learning about lead in Maine soils. I just want to remind everyone that we are having the soil shop this upcoming Saturday, so come find us at the Portland Farmers Market with your soil samples, and we will test them on the XRF for free. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.